We are live now, we can start.
You told me that I am a girl, so pink is mine. You told him that he is a boy, so blue is his. So did all the colors of the rainbow vanished? A very good evening to one and all present here. I am Rudrani Garg and I welcome you all to today's session organized by Anna Jori on Gender is Not a Spectrum. Before we delve into today's session, may I first wish you all a very happy Republic Day and a happy Saraswati Puja. We have often come across the question inquiring how many genders exist and minded it is gender and not sex. But this century, being much more liberal, accepting, and at the same time expressive and inclusive, the question of gender identity has been again and again raised, with things becoming much more inclusive and the need to recognize all the genders is becoming much more important, freeing them from the oppressive order. From time immemorial, the idea gender has been euphemized into the biological sexes, having a class difference of the superior class having the ones with the genitals which are convex and that of the inferior ones whose genitals are concave. This Republic Day, the session aims in widening our horizon, in becoming much more inclusive and at the same time accepting the wider spectrum. Before we begin into today's session, allow me to give a brief about Anna Jori. Anajori, which means the bond of love, it means unconditional love. And it is indeed this unconditional love that has brought Milan Tatta right from the US to here in that of the Northeastern region, who have started this initiative of Anajori, a non-profit organization way back in 2018, which engages and promotes various initiatives that strive for social change, leadership skills, and building entrepreneurship capabilities in and across Northeast, particularly aiming that of Assam. From the past few months, we have been engaging speakers from various fields via virtual media to create a network among people working in this region. And indeed, today's session yet presents us an incredible opportunity as because we would be learning things beyond the biological sexes and understanding the gender spectrum in a wider and deeper perspective. Every one of us exists in some point in the gender spectrum determined by the individual idiosyncratic nature of our particularistic tendencies and identities, and at the same time depends largely upon our subjective experiences that we have undergone. I often wonder that if I was not assigned a particular gender right at the time of birth, what would I be now? Once we start accepting that they are infinite gender, we become someone much more accepting. And at the same time, we start understanding and empathizing with one another. At the same time, also start respecting each other on the very grounds of being human first and then an assigned identity later. What triggers me further is the very fact that we are politically linking gender, and that in itself has become very much violent and at the same time oppressive, and at the same time the very question if it is possible to ban gender altogether. Well, on this note, I shall no longer wait and introduce our guest for today's session, Anamitra Bora. Anamitra Bora is a research scholar in sociology from Cotton University, a prospective PhD scholar, a part-time stylist whose passion is about policing, sociology of political violence, and gender non-conformity entangled with nationalism. Without any further say, I would request thereby Anamitra Bora to kindly share her views regarding today's topic. Over to you.
Thank you, Rudra. That was wonderful. A very good evening to everyone present here today. So I'm gonna first, since we are talking about gender, right? So I thought that it would be very important for all of us to understand how we use certain methods of imagining freedom, right? Freedom would basically mean away from constraints. And that's very constitutive of how gender non-binary and transgender people kind of imagine things. Okay. Before that, I would also like to talk a little bit about the vector of violence, right? And who is this vector of violence when we talk about the gender binary model? It is definitively biology that is the vector of violence here. So anyway, before I start, I would just want to make you guys understand how we imagine freedom, right? There are two things. When we talk about freedom, we have to understand how can we imagine the way to liberation. And that itself comes from the idea of power, right? So power can be of two forms, right? Number one, it is power to, and number two, it's power over. Power to is somewhat relatable, right? And power over means that I am kind of creating a hierarchy here. So, okay, let's start like this. Power to would mean that I, as a gender non-binary person, right? I want safer public restrooms. I would voice out my opinions. I would voice out logical systems and reasonings for people like me to be able to use restrooms safely, right? So that would be my politics, power to. Now, power over would mean that the state does not or cannot conceive, and not only the state, the law itself. The law cannot conceive who is a gender non-binary person, right? So basically what the law in India does is they categorize things: male, female, and the hijras, the transgender community. They don't have any idea what the idea of this transgenderism means, right? So they collapse all these particular identities. It could be trans women, trans men, gender non-conforming people, all these under one unitary method, right? And this unitary method is also somewhat problematic. That is also like a very colonial way of thinking, which I'll come to it later. Okay. So power, I was talking about power to, and I was talking about power over, right? So when I talk about power over, I mean to say a person cannot gain freedom unless this over thing is eradicated, right? Like, unless we are free from certain constraints. So transgender people or non-binary people, they have always had like this, how do I put it? This fear of death, right? It's so easy, right? Like we can be killed immediately because of the fact that we live by freedom. We live by the very fact that we do not understand the gender binary model, which is also itself plastic in the way, right? In its own conception, because it's the colonials who colonized all the parts of like the world, and they brought in this binary model where they said, okay, the man has to do all the work outside the home, and the women who has to be submissive and very subservient, right? She has to stick inside the domestic, doing the work of labor, doing the work of care, right? So basically this is the binary colonial method which made sure that transgenderism is away from the house, the concept of domesticity. Basically, what I'm trying to point out here is how they naturalize biology every time. So when I talk about biology, I'm trying to mean here that we use certain categories, right? Like today I can say that this is a male, this is a female. How is a male becoming a male, right? I'll be using certain concepts here. If you guys do not understand, please raise your hand, okay? Like I do not want to be the only person speaking. Okay. Okay. So what happens is basically when we sex a body, right? There is a theorist known as Suzanne Stryker. So Suzanne Stryker is a very interesting person, right? She's also a trans woman, and she tells us that the very concept of telling people that the sperm producing person and the ovum producing person is to be categorized as male or female is itself problematic, because there could be many people like the intersex, right? Like we know there are so many people with intersex, there are so many people with congenital diseases and stuff like that, whom we categorize. Hello.
You are audible. You can continue it.
Audible?
Yes, you're audible.
Yeah, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Where was I? Yeah, about the power model, right? So basically, what happened is how we constitute. So, for example, if there is a male person, right, how we see a male is becoming a male, right? In a society that is very heteronormative and patriarchal, a male becomes a male by the sex he belongs to, right? And what Suzanne Stryker was talking about is how we kind of like twist and turn biology in order to make sure that there is a unitary way of looking at things, right? So basically what happens is when a person is producing the sperm, they are categorized as male, and when the person is producing ovaries or ovum, the eggs, they are known as female, right? But this whole concept itself is ludicrous at the same time, because Susan Stryker is saying that sex is not the same as gender, but both of them are co-constitutive, right? So in the sense, like when we say that there are intersex people that's living among us, the gender binary model, the sex model itself becomes mutated, right? Like it's not what it seems, right? When we think that okay, the male has to have this and female has to have that, intersex people come in between and tell you that this is not what it is, right? So that is why the whole idea of gender and using biology to utilize the fact that trans people need to be eradicated from the society is itself problematic, right? And we also see how intersex people, if you guys have studied, intersex people have been mutilated most number of times, right? More than what we see, like the medical concept, like how in medicine also trans people are not given hormones and everybody like that is like, it's fundamentally violent institution that upholds the sex binary model, right? More than that, now I would like to come about the idea of, like, I want to talk about how binary model and non-binary model is also somewhat like, how do we kind of complicate these issues, right? It could be like this. If I'm today saying that I'm non-binary, right? Is the other person binary? And if so, why do we keep on saying that the gender is a spectrum, right? If gender itself is a spectrum, does that mean that the person who is also binary can also like shift around, like can be like moving from one end to the other, or it can be a multiple way of living modalities, right? So what I'm trying to point out here is that sometimes or the other, we have to understand that non-binary people or people who are destroying or who are actually understanding the violence of gender is actually trying to tell you guys that the very concept of gender is plastic. It's itself created, right? Like it's on the outside, and the construction is itself construction is between a signifier and signified, and that itself is problematic. So basically, when I'm telling you that I live as a non-binary person, my whole philosophy of living life is itself like not like non-binary, right? Everywhere I have to think twice. I have to be like, okay, this is a colonial method of living life, and it's itself violent. If I see in black and white categories, it's problematic for me because I'm not trying to understand nuance of living realities, right? And that is why I feel like the whole concept of sex and gender both are co-constitutive, and if we have to understand this, we also have to understand how biopower comes in between. So biopower is a concept that was talked by Foucault a lot, and he was actually talking about how once we became stable beings, right, once you identify and start calcifying your identity as a man in a society and as a woman in a society, it becomes easier for the state to control you, right? It becomes easier for the state to control you because all these ideas of like family, marriage, and everything starts seeming normal when it's not. We know we have to talk about how cis heteronormativity upholds violence in marriage. We have to talk about how abuse and mental health is how constructed on the same living lines of marriages, of institutions such as those which restrict people like us from enjoying loving for all human beings. So that's how it is. Yeah. Is there any questions? Rudrani. Hello,
Yes.
Rudrani, can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
are there any questions? I just want to I don't want to be the only person talking here, so.
Right now, I can see no question, but I'll urge all the participants to drop the questions on the board and we can just go through it when it would come. But
Okay.
by far, it's really very interesting regarding as to how the state has power over marriage and family
Mhm.
life, etc.
Yeah. Uh, Yeah. So I also do want to talk about a lot of how policing happens with people from our community, right? Like how policing affects people from our community. So basically, when I talk about policing, I want to talk about how the policing substance comes about, right? The moment you see me wearing a skirt or wearing a crop or whatever, I want to ask that why is it that there is a fear that's produced? And if this fear is there, how can we try to come to a middle ground and understand that these things itself is not natural, right? All the ways in which we look at each other is so fluid, right? And that is also how I want to go back to Suzanne Stryker, who I was mentioning before. Suzanne Stryker was also talking about in physics, in quantum physics, how the very idea of proton and electron are in a constant flux. So basically, these atom molecules, right? They do not come as a self-determinate form. They do not show that okay, if I'm in this particular position, I have to go straight in this particular order only. It's not like that. It's like a wave, right? So these Suzanne Stryker was talking about how in nature also everything seems to be in a flux. And when I talk about flux, it means it deviates from dimorphicity. It deviates from the idea that this and this has to be the only way of living, right? And Suzanne Stryker actually talks about this very notion of quantum physics and brings about the idea of how biology itself is a vector of violence, right? For all the trans people and intersex people, which I've talked about before. And I would also want to talk about how this conception itself is so Eurocentric, right? Because before, if we have studied about indigenous people that have been living in North America or anywhere else, right? The Hijra community also, people have been living. It's not that we have always, it's just a new certain kind of a creation, right? It's not a new creation that has just come popped up out of nowhere. People have been actually trying to make up for all the ways they feel about their bodies, right? But in a capitalistic society and in a society where the state runs our life courses, they tell you that this is the only way of living. And that's when violence comes about, right? And that is also how policing affects here. I was doing a research on how I was doing my research in Guwahati, right? It was based in Guwahati, and I was studying how many trans people have been facing violence, right from rape, molestation, all these are ways in which they are not even allowed to dress properly or dress according to their wishes. They know, all trans people know this, they have been living with this fear, right? That we are not being able to be ourselves. We are not being able to talk for our lives. We are not even given a proper space to talk about these things. I'm so thankful that we have spaces like this today. Before, it has been a long fight to come to this point, right? So that is how I feel like gender itself is a very problematic thing, right? Come on, look at the examples of cisgender women, right? Okay, how women, they understand that if you have studied, if you have been in university or something, we know that girls are supposed to come back to their hostels by 8 p.m. They cannot be staying in the library around till 12 or something like that. When I was in DU, I was told like this, right? The girls in my friends list, they were told you have to come back by around 8. If it has changed now, I'm not sure. But this, because of gender, because of the the violence of surveillance, because of the violence of surveillance that comes from the family first, who puts them in hostels, and then this hostel interrogates the gender of this women, right? That means the idea that you are not free. You cannot be free from a certain period of time, right? Although various other things comes about, like the patriarchy, the issue of how men also kind of produce violence in these cases, right? So what I'm trying to point out is how the very idea of gender produces subjectivities. So yeah.
Hi, Anamitra, Kashmira here.
Hi, Kashmira. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have shared your experience little bit about that. You have mentioned that you means identify yourself as a non-binary person. So
Yes.
could you please share your stories that how means your experience as a non-binary person? Because our mindset or our idea of gender is binary. So and most of
Right.
the people have that concept, and you are living there with them. And means could you please share your experience? Means what type of question you face and how do you answer their questions?
Yeah, of course, of course. Thank you so much for the question, Kashmira. So basically, as I was growing up, right, I was growing up in an Assamese family, and if you compare Assamese family to a traditional families from North India or anywhere apart from Assam, you would understand that how Brahminical patriarchy constantly works in these nooks and corners of India, right? So I was never like as a person coming from an indigenous marginalized background, right, and also queer, and also who has tribal identity. So we were always like told that masculinity for us is in a constant fluid. So as I was growing up, I used to be like, I used to see natok performances, right, in gaos, in where my father used to stay. Yeah. So where my father used to say, there was a natok bhavna believe no bhavna. So there's like bhavna hoy, তাৰপিছত ৰাগ hoy. So all these things, right? I was always like exposed to this numerical, like not numerical, sorry, numerous ways of like embracing the fluidity of masculinity. Like I was never told, like by my parents also, like, Anamita, you have to strictly be like this. Even if I was showing some signs of like how typically we produce like called femininity, right? I was never told that, okay, Anamitra, even if you're trying to embrace this, or even if you're trying to experiment with these things, it has to be somewhat like what, like bad for you, right? But I also do understand, I take recourse of my privilege identity, right? There are many people who do not have the same experiences as me, right? So I do not speak for them. So what happened is, as I was growing up, I started reading a lot. Like I was bullied first, because what happens to a non-binary or a trans person? You are told hijra from outside, even before you know you're hijra. Do you get my point? Like it's
Yeah.
the people outside who has to first inform you that what your subjectivity is, even before I try to experiment with it. I can be anything in between, right? But it's how gender functions. It's because they do not understand, because as they have been growing up, they've seen one unitary method of living, and that is by being masculine. And how do you become masculine? You have to be emotionless, you have to be aggressive, you have to take care of your family. These are the certain basic ideas, right? Like we all know this. Once you start existing outside that paradigm, people become very fearful of that thing, because they cannot imagine that far. And that is also why how I started talking about imagining freedom in the very first time, right? So what happened is, like, as I was getting bullied, I remember I was trying to and I was trying to like coddle shame, right? So shame was a big part, and that I think it plays a big part in all queer families and like queer friendships, right? How how shame is actually pervades our whole idea of being, right? And shame allows us to be restrictive. Shame permits us not to move beyond the binaries. It's because we see that if one person is getting bullied, the person who is witnessing the bullying, they are also like, okay, wait, I cannot, like, this is something that's bad, like this is something bad happening, and I don't want to be a part of this process. right? So as I was growing up, I remember how people had used to bully me a lot in school, and I think a lot of violence. I think I had physical violence also, and physical violence because of the fact that they could not tolerate that I was feminine, right? So they had to come and like throw paper bags, or like these are funny things for me right now because I'm talking about it a lot many times. But for a person who was young at that point of time, it was really, I think anybody would have reached the limit of their life then, right? Nobody wants to live a life where you're not like embracing your full self, right? And also, like, apart from that, I have my extended families, right? They could not like see that Anamitra has changed so much in the course of their life, right? They were always expecting that Anamitra would grow up to be this very masculine person, and that typical masculine person, right? So that was happening. And at the same time, even in institutions that I study, right, like in college or whatever, I think people in academia are still not being able to digest that trans people are like, can take the forefront, can talk about issues, can actually have leadership positions, right? Many people, many institutions are still heteronormative. Basically, it's like they are not being able to produce safe spaces for kids like us, right? And when we talk about like safe being, like, even bathroom comes last. But what, even if I enter, I bring history with me, right? If I enter a classroom, I bring history with me. I bring the history of violence that trans people have before carried. But these people in colleges or even in like any institutions, right, they are not respect, they do not respect our being. Most of the time it's always like, koino in Assamese thatta kore, ba like insults. This insult is itself an injury, right? Like it produces more wounds, and if a person is not overcoming their shame, I think these wounds can stay for a long time and they don't heal easily. So as I was growing up, I remember like people used to be very fearful of me, like because of the fact that I used to wear flamboyant makeup. I used to like, wear earrings and stuff like, which typically men don't, right? And they cannot see that also because, like, I told you how biology is like constantly playing in the background, right, of people's mind. And so as I was trying to negate myself from those boxes of being a man and a woman, I was facing violence at every step. Even today also, I remember, I still know that my mother feels unsafe when I tell her that I'm going to return back home at around 8 or 9, because she's always like thinking, okay, even if I have the freedom to go out and wear proper makeup and like, live a life of respectability, there still is a possibility that something might happen to me. And it's not like, I don't want to say that as like Assamese people or like this people or this people is a very liberal space, and so I don't face violence. It's not the reality in practical sense, right? I think even Sarah Ahmed talks about how spaces become political, right? If a particular person, if a particular body comes across and reorients themselves to a particular space, it becomes heteronormative. How do spaces become heteronormative? Like, we have to keep on thinking about these things, and even if we enter these heteronormative spaces, we have to be constantly aware of how people are perceiving us, right? And that itself is such, I think, like, it is violent. And violence does not mean physical violence. I'm so sorry. Violence does not mean physical violence only. It could be emotional. It could be the ways in which people are winking at each other. It could be the ways in which people are whispering about this person. It could be the ways in which they don't pass you the bill. It could be the ways in which they're rude on your face, right? So I think it's also a part of how sexist socialization happens in all societies. And but at the same time, I do hope, I nurture a lot of hope in me, right? Because there are many poets like Audre Lorde and Adrienne Rich. They are Black feminist, lesbian poets. They keep on talking about love, right? How if we garner love, you do not even have to understand what I'm going through. You just have to be compassionate enough to understand that I'm a human being. So yeah, that happens. And I don't want you guys to see me as a victim, okay? Like, I don't want you to be like, this is a poor person, this is, you know, like, this is that, like, this is a victim of it. No, I think trans people should also not be seen as victims. Most of the times we're immediately thinking that, you know, they must be victim of sexist social, which is, yes, because of their bodies, because of the ways in which socialization happens. But it does not mean they do not have the liberty to live a free life. Yeah. Yeah. Rudrani, are you there? Kashmira? I think I hope I have answered your question.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Yeah. So
It is really lovely listening to your complete journey, specifically wishing you more power to you and many other people. And I'm sure many people have, of course, gotten a lot inspired. At the same time, I personally have this question regarding restroom. So that's one thing that you also mentioned in your speech. So
right.
so the very fact that on one hand we talk about the need for having a separate restroom, on the other hand we also talk about letting a person feel the way they want to feel, which might also at the same time include a gender neutral washroom. So which one would be a more preferential preference kind of for you and for the rest?
Okay. So wow, this is such an important question. Thank you, Rudrani. Okay. So this very concept of like restrooms, right? If we think back from history, restrooms were actually places where bodies, waste materials could be expelled, right?
Yes.
Who gets to expel these things? That's also very important, because let's talk about the society of India only. Okay, there are still many people who defecate outside, or we have seen these things, right? Like, we are very well aware of how defecation and peeing and all these things, how societies also like enable these people to not have safe restroom spaces, right? um so the very idea of like, many people think that that's where transphobia comes in, right? So basically, many people think that trans women are not basically women. They are men dressed up as women, right? I don't know what dressing up means, but like, you get my point, right? I'm just trying to make it intelligible. So basically, they think that if a trans woman enters a bathroom that's specifically assigned for women or female, they're actually focusing on the sex part, right? Which I have previously explained to you how sex is, as Judith Butler told, sex bostutu jota ami kotha koi thako no, it's actually a repetitive pattern. Sex bostutu keneke hoi jay, it's because the doctors assign you these things, right? And it become as a repetitive way that, okay, you are sperm producing, so you become male, you're egg producing, so you become female, right? But again, when I talk about how intersex people and like how people with different kind of genetic makeup, how they kind of break down these ideas, right? So the right wing, or the people from the people of that kind of politics, they think that these people are trying to um, attack on women, right? Like, it could be cis women, and I think many cis women are also think it that way, right? But clearly it's not. If we have read the statistics, if we have seen how it works, it's never a trans woman, it's a cis man who actually uh, provokes violence, right, towards gender marginalized people. So I do not think like it's a very, how do I put it, like, it's a way in which we naturalize things, right? And that is also why I want people to deeply think about biology, right? How it serves as a weapon for these kind of ideologies to seep in and uh like provoke violence for trans people, right? So I have never understood like, why would like people from the right wing, or any people, right, like any people with power, why would they think it like that? Only when the only thing we want is like safe spaces to pee, Like that's the only space where we want. And also another point to be added here is, we have noticed, like when I'm talking about male violence, right? I'm not denying that even when students, like little kids grow up in bathrooms, right? Many cases I have read and researched, like rape happens in boys' locker rooms, rape happens in men's washroom. So I'm just trying to understand here, why do we keep on like talking about this male, female, when we know how violence operates, when there's literal facts all over the internet, when there's statistics all over, and we still think why, and we still understand, okay, this is the way it works, right? Can we go beyond the biology? Can we go beyond the biology and let trans people speak for themselves? So I do believe that gender neutral bathroom is absolutely essential for people, right? At the end of the day, we just want to like what? Expel the waste materials, right, from our body. And I don't think that also has been politicized at this point. And it has always been like that, you know. They do not want trans people to enter any spaces, basically. And that is also the reason why bills are passed in US, right? So, yeah.
Well, that's a really interesting perspective that I got. In between, in your bio data, you also there's a small mention as to gender non-conformity entangled with nationalism. So we have seen that female or male, we have seen a particularistic kind of nationalism ideology that they have entailed over the years now. But there's again very little, I believe, the literature or any kind of I would use the word unidentified contribution of trans people or the third sex. So I would really find it really very interesting, and at the same time very curious if you could highlight some kind of contribution, or at the same time give the space for them to, know
Yeah.
about these things.
Yeah, I think that's another interesting question. Thank you, Rudrani. So basically, when I talk about nationalism, I always feel like when we also engage in like these nationalist spirits, right? We always talking about two ways of looking at each other, and this is also where gender comes in. So basically, I'm saying that you are the other, I am the in. So I'm trying to I'm trying to multiply my community so as to dominate over your community, right? So I'm just saying that how do I become a nationalist? I have to, first of all, feel the fear that my state is in threat or my culture is in threat. But what a liberation perspective would like look at this, right? A liberation perspective would be like, all the places that we live in earth today is not ours. It's for everyone to cohabit, right? It's for everyone to coexist together and shatter those boundaries and borders. Nationalism itself seeks that thing, right? If we look at the history of nationalist movements anywhere, you would see that it's the masculinized hope, it's the masculinized idea of who becomes a member of the state, right? Who captures the power. But at the same time, they are saying that the land is a woman, that I need to be Bharat Mata, like for example, right? It's a Mata, like it's a motherland. Anything, right? So what I'm trying to say is like they have to conquer over the mother in order to feel safe, right? They have to protect the borders, they have to protect all these things, right? So in order to feel that okay, they are safe. But are we really safe in this sense, right? Harm has always been the very factor of capitalism, right? Harm has always been there, and I think it will always be there. Like you cannot live in a society where you can say absolutely that okay, there'll be no harm. That's just impractical, right? So what happens is, when we understand nationalism, I talked about proliferation, right? How if I see you as the other and I am the person who's in part of the community, I have to first of all multiply. How do I multiply? How do I make sure that my community thrives and yours does not? What will I do? The state does one thing. They produce a heterodox families, right? Like heteronormative families. Basically, what they tell you is like, you have to create all these families, different sorts of families, multiply, create population, increase the population, and then we can dominate over the ones that are like who do not have, who are lessly populated, right? So basically what I'm trying to point out here is that gay people or people with different orientation whose love do not conform to men or women, or it could be also, they are ostracized. They are told that you are not, like, you cannot fight for our country, or you cannot be, you know, what's the use of you living in this country, right? Like when you don't even, when you can't even produce kids. And we are always told, like, even as a queer non-binary gay person, I'm always like, I've been always asked, like, তোমার বাচ্চা কেনেকে হবে, right? তোমার বাচ্চা ho, like, do you want kids in the future, right? And when I say that I don't want kids, or I'm not ready to answer to that question at this point, they're like shocked, right? Because somewhere in the back of the mind, the very concept of family is playing. And who is guiding that family? Who is guiding that nuclear family? Is the state, right? The state tells you that you have to create these families, and otherwise you're at risk. Otherwise the outsiders will come about and they will like conquer over your land, right? So in the same way, I think women are also like dominated like this, right? I think there's a lack of trans feminist scholarship also in Assam at the same time, because that is also the reason why I'm researching about this. How, you know, trans people in our land, in our state, are incarcerated. If you're very aware of how the politics of CAA and NRC is going on, we know how trans people are incarcerated in detention centers and stuff like that, right? Because they cannot produce their biodata, because they have ran away from their homes, they have ran away from their families. They don't have the particular identities to show to the magistrate that, okay, I am a part of this land only. You cannot like ostracize me, or you cannot deport me to somewhere else, right? So I think a lot of research is lacking on this part. And one of the ways in which I feel like we have to complicate this process of like looking at others and how we see ourselves. Yeah.
Well, thank you. It was really interesting, specifically to have a new perspective regarding transgender scholarship, which is true that Assam does not have many in this platform. At the same time, it's also very, very uneven to see the fact that there's only one single transgender university that's there all across India. At the same time, there's a lack of schools as well. At a wider perspective, we see that in the case of India, we see it's more of the southern part where people of this particular community feel much more free in comparison to the northern side. And at the same time, you also spoke about caste, so how the biodata non-present thing is the very reason as to why they are getting ostracized. So yeah, there's a lot of new perspectives that I particularly have learned. And really, it's very, very much saddening, the very fact that we are still seeing, despite it being the 21st century, despite it being the capitalist order where your own merit counts, that we are still seeing that people are still ostracizing and pushing people to a particular edge of the society where they want to dominate and have a power over rather than a power to. So it's really very interesting to have these new perspectives altogether. I would now open the floor for further questions. And if anybody has any question, kindly drop it in the chat box.
good question. Do non-binary people go for transgender? I mean, a lot of it depends on the subjectivity of non-binary people also, right? So basically, there are many non-binary people who might not want to go for like surgery, right? As a trans women might like to go through, right? And it all depends upon how you perceive yourself and how much you feel safe to even go for these expensive hormone replacement therapies, right? So basically, there are non-binary people who I'm talking about our community, right? Like how non-binary people are also like tries to go away from these sort of bureaucratic processes, right? Because what these things does is basically put a stamp and naturalize your identity in the sense, right? When non-binary people are telling you that we are constantly in a flux. So could be when non-binary people feel like that, but most probably I'm not really quite sure if they would want to go for like something like that. Yeah, because it puts a permanent mark on that, right? And then the very process of your politics becomes dysfunctional in that sense. Yeah, I hope I answered your question, Kashmira. If there's another, yeah, okay. So
Is there any other question? Because I think the chat box is not visible to me right now. So is there any other question? If there's no further question, then I have a question right now. Uh, what is your perspective if it is possible to ban or abolish gender altogether, or is it necessary for us to like evolve gender instead of abolishing it altogether?
Wow, great question. So when I talk about like abolishing gender, right, I'm not saying that your gender identity becomes invalid. What I'm trying to say is that the systems in which we are connected to it, right, the ways in which, suppose I go to an education institute and I'm like immediately asked to fill up the boxes, right? So small certain things, even the concept of marriage. I mean, we go to a like marriage ceremony, we see how a man and a woman, nowadays we have the gays. That's a different thing. That's also not radical enough. So what happens is basically people are some way or the other connected to systems of power, basically. And I always try to pinpoint to the fact that how state is uh, impeding these forces, right? So when I say that we need to develop a politics of understanding how we can abolish these things, I'm not saying that okay, you become invalid. Like if you are a cisgender woman, there's everything wrong with you. And if I'm a non-binary person, I'm the one who's like on top, right? Like I'm the best. No, it's nothing like that. But in the ways in which we have to understand how our oppression is ubiquitous, right? If I'm oppressed today, are you being able to give me your hands and tell me that, okay, I can also like go beyond what I'm thinking right now, right? What is so natural for me becomes unnatural when I'm understanding trans politics, right? So that is also the way in which I want to like go beyond that thing, right? I'm not saying that you have to be a non-binary or you have to be a trans person in order to like see all these things. I think we all understand how gender itself is violent, right? In any sort of case, men itself, like I'm not saying men are not like getting oppressed under this institution, right? We know how men are not allowed to express themselves emotionally, and even they are like they feel emasculinated, right? When they express themselves, small things like that. And even about power, like there is a boss and they are the working force, right? So the boss shows a different kind of a masculinity to entice the working class, right? So we have to kind of understand, and that also thanks to a trans women called Cornell. I think she did an amazing work on masculinities and stuff like that, right? So I'm just saying that we have to detach ourselves from these structures that enable violence. I'm not saying that we have to completely destroy a whole thing or something like. If we are destroying, also we have to be able to understand how do we create new structure, new life forces. Yeah.
That is really very much new in a new way to rethink the things which are already established in the society right now.
Right.
I'll open the box for another 1 minute, and if not,
Yeah.
then we can just wrap up the session.
All right. Some scholars say that gender is fluid. If gender is fluid, it's obvious that at some point of time a person can identify as a man, Yeah, absolutely. I think that is also the politics of abolition, right? So they are telling you that you can be a man, women, and it's nothing wrong about that. You can be whatever you feel like, or even if there are myriad ways of like living, right? That is how I'm trying to point out how abolition is talking about. We we need to get away from these gendered systems of living, right? Can you hear me?
Yes, yes,
Yeah,
I
we
I
can.
can.
Yeah. So we have to like get away from this materialized form of living. And I'm again and again pointing out that we are always becoming. We have not become. We always become. It's a way of seeing ourselves, right? So whatever you feel like, you must be able to have you must be able to be free from those constraints, which I talked about in the first, like power to power over. So these are the constraints, right? The constraints could be gender, it could be biology, it could be power, it could be fascism, right? Anything as such. So these are the things that have constrained us and molded us into one unitary way of being, that is man, women. So I'm sure there's nothing wrong in it. And you can always feel whatever you feel like, and we are always becoming, right? But the ways in which these things that I just mentioned, how they enforce a natural way of seeing gender, that is problematic. And I think we can all try to like question these things every day. Try to have a conversation with trans people of any sorts, right? And see us, like love us even more, like because we need that love, right? And the love sustains every one of us. So yeah. Could you please highlight a few points on degendering? Wow. I think many of the ways in which we practice, like, first of all, we have to be like, the very idea is to be creative, right? I think in a capitalist world, in a way in which we live today, I think it's always, we are always seen like we have to live a particular way, right? Like we have to see the ways in which we dress, for example, how a trans or a queer person dresses themselves, right? How they're so passionate about things, how they question every model of living, right? How we need to understand how gender becomes so violent. If you start questioning that, if you start questioning how it is violent and it's oppressing, right? I think we can start one by one. And it's not a practice like you have to be there and you have to be correct all the time. We can make mistakes, right? We are all at the end of the day, we are all human beings. But if we want to degender, if you want to stay like critique gender, you also have to be able to see how violence propagates because of biology, how violence propagates because of fascism, how in every institution gender has become so dimorphic. It's getting out of hand, right? So yeah. That's that. Have I answered your question, Kashmira? Yeah. All right.
Well, is there any other question? Am I connected right now?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can
Okay.
hear you, Rudrani.
Okay, thank you. If there's no further question, then we can just go forward with the with wrapping up the today's session. So, by far, whatever discussion we have held, by far it's really fruitful. I'm sure each one of us listening today, we have gotten new perspectives, new ideas regarding the very same. At the same time, I wish you and every other person in the same forum more power, and at the same time more
Thank you.
more opportunities in order to portray and at the same time foray what you really desire. And it's true that the world is shrinking in terms of love, but what I personally believe is that we need to understand as human beings that there's underneath every skin color runs the same color of blood, that is red, the color that symbolizes love and not hatred. So with this, I wish each one of you a very nice evening forward, and at the same time also a lot of power to you and all the rest of people who are struggling in their day-to-day life, and a lot of positivity. With this, thank you all for joining us today in this session. And definitely the very idea is that we do not need to be somebody who is not acceptable on the grounds of being yourself. The only thing today is about being yourself, not being somebody for the others. So with this positive note, I thank you all once again for joining, and hope to meet you all soon again. Thank you.